Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to this second webinar in the series from BS Group, the organisers, around FuelEU Maritime. We're going to have a few minutes while we wait for people to join us, coming off their calls, etc., etc. But in the meantime, I can very quickly introduce our panel here today. There's me, Conor Fürstenberg Stott from Fürstenberg Maritime Advisory, Rachel Hoyland of Council Maritime Decarbonisation at Stephenson Harwood, Andreas Gaardsdal, Risk Analyst at DS NORDEN, and Stavros, Niotis, Chief Sustainability Officer at Prime Marine. Today we are going to be looking at FuelEU Maritime, which is coming over the horizon imminently on the 1st of January next year. The brief we have is regarding understanding FuelEU Maritime and the overview, market dynamics, impact on bunker fuel procurement, technological innovations and infrastructure, meeting the compliance standards, global implications and future outlook. We have about an hour and a half today, just before Christmas. We hope you find it interesting. And I'm just going to open the Q&A section here. There is a Q&A section, so please don't hesitate to put your questions in the Q&A section. We will get to them towards the end if we haven't covered them already in our dialogue. So, just to let the clock run down a little bit, maybe we could go around the table here and introduce ourselves. Would you like to kick us off, Rachel?
Sure. Thanks very much, Conor. My name's Rachel. I'm a maritime decarbonisation lawyer, as Conor said, at law firm Stephenson Harwood. I'm part of a wider team that works on energy transition and decarbonisation issues across a number of sectors. In the past, I would have introduced myself in this space as a shipping lawyer, and indeed I spent about 12 years working with clients throughout the shipping industry in private practice, and I was also in-house in one of the biggest ship owners in the world. But decarbonisation came across my desk around about 5 years ago, I would say. I was involved in some projects with the International Maritime Organisation and with the UK Department for Transport. And since that time, that became an increasingly large part of my practice as it's become steadily and increasingly important issues for the shipping industry. And over the last 12 months, I've had full focus on maritime decarbonisation issues for shipping. So my brief is quite wide. My work encompasses dealing with things like environmental attributes, insetting, retrofitting of ships, renewable fuels, alternative fuels. There's a whole basket of issues that falls within the decarbonisation for maritime pot. That, of course, includes advising on regulations for shipping and the way that they impact the industry. I was very closely involved in the development of the EU ETS for shipping and advising on that throughout its various draft stages, as well as when it reached final form. And I'm involved at the moment as well in the UK government consultation on the expansion of the UK emissions trading scheme. FuelEU, of course, a particularly interesting, complex piece of regulation that we're going to get into today. So advising on that and particularly looking at some of the contractual implications in connection with that are hot topics on my desk at the moment.
Okay, who'd like to go next? Stavros.
Thank you, Conor. Good afternoon. My name is Stavros Niotis. I'm a Chief Sustainability Officer for Prime Marine over the last 3 years. Naval architect and marine engineer as a background, and most of my career I have spent on classification societies and on other shipping governance in the past before that. Well, my key role within the company is to help towards the sustainability pathways and decarbonization strategies, ESG reporting, and of course monitoring and advising the technical team on the various, especially environmental regulations that are coming in, like EU ETS, FuelEU, and of course all the other IMO initiatives and discussions that we have ongoing. Primarine is a shipping company. Our core business is LR1 oil product tankers. We currently operate a fleet of 13 ships, mainly LR1s, MR tankers as well, and one ammonia dedicated carrier. I will pass it on to Andreas. Thank you for having me, and happy to start this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stavros. Hi, everyone. My name is Andreas Gaardsdal. I'm working as a risk analyst in DS NORDEN. And for the last 1.5 years, more or less, I've been the subject matter expert on the FuelEU Maritime regulation, both in terms of the entire organizational architecture and how to implement it in the organization, and also driving the commercial strategy and the contractual approaches that we have are dealing with. But DS NORDEN is a large Danish multinational shipping company with more than 150 years of experience and operating both in the dry and wet bulk as well as in the project cargoes. And this is also the size that we are bringing to the table in this FuelEU Maritime is also what we are riding a lot on. We also always been working with the sustainable pathways, so that's FuelEU is actually playing well into this area, and it's driving our. We can use this experience in driving our FuelEU Maritime compliance going forward. So that's the experience that I'm coming with here as a subject matter expert from a large owner operator, and how we have both commercially and organizationally been having to deal with FuelEU Maritime for the past 1.5 years since it was adopted.
Thanks, Andreas. And for me, we are Fürstenberg Maritime Advisory. We sit here in the south of Sweden. It's just myself and Sophia. We set up to help the maritime industry towards providing a fully sustainable service. And in that, we see the industry to be a potential catalyst for assisting with sustainability globally. So what we really burn for is assisting entities with developing their sustainability strategies, something we've done recently for a large P&I club, and we've previously done for a chemical tanker company, for instance. But we also on our journey have become, obviously, as it's the hottest topic, very involved with decarbonisation. We spent a period of time as the maritime directors for the Ammonia Energy Association and learned an awful lot in that process. So since the beginning of our journey, we have seen enormous changes and enormous development with decarbonisation, and this FuelEU Maritime is one of the most pressing now manifestations of this decarbonisation in the industry. So as we move ahead to addressing some questions here, I would like to read you a short paragraph from a recent DNV white paper about FuelEU Maritime, if I can. So just bear with me for a second. FuelEU relies on the methods, criteria, and fuel certification framework of the Renewable Energy Directive for biofuels, renewable fuels of non-biological origin, RFNBO, and recycled carbon fuel, and on the recast gas directive for low carbon fuels. Only sustainable fuels with an at least 50 to 65% non-food or fed crop biofuels, or 70% all other fuels, greenhouse gas saving compared to a fossil fuel reference value, 94 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule, can use actual certified greenhouse gas intensity values for well-to-wake emissions. Note that the CO2 from biogenic carbon or avoided CO2 emissions for RFNBOs and RCFs are deducted as part of the well-to-tank emissions and included as part of the tank-to-wake CO2 emissions. In a well-to-wake perspective, the CO2 emissions from combustion or conversion is then neutral. So I read that out just to illustrate how this is a bit mind-blowing for some of us who are looking at this. So as a first question, can we go around the table, starting with you, Rachel? So let's assume you're in a lift and someone says, what do you do? Blah, blah. You get talking and you mention FuelEU Maritime. How would you explain to a complete novice, what is FuelEU Maritime?
Okay, it's a good scenario. I've been in a lift, so I can relate to this. I think the first thing I would say is I would probably start with giving a little bit of context on the shipping industry, which is what's being regulated here. And I would say that the shipping industry is a complex ecosystem of stakeholders who are connected by way of commercial contracts. Those stakeholders have different interests in an asset, and their interests may or may not overlap with regard to timeframes. So the timeframes in which these stakeholders have interest in an asset aren't perfectly aligned. That's the shipping industry. Then you're going to interpose on that FuelEU, which is a piece of regulation which essentially impacts one area of the ecosystem with the aim of changing behavior in a different area. And the mission of FuelEU is to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of fuel used by the industry, essentially to lessen the contribution to global warming that's being made by the consumption of fuel. That's the thrust of FuelEU. When you bring those two things together, you're in quite a, this is where we hope it's a tall building and the lift's got some way to go yet. What you're essentially doing is you're bringing, when you get hold of FuelEU, this quite multi-dimensional piece of legislation whereby parties have freedom to decide how they want to respond to it. They respond within a landscape of uncertainty as to fuel availability, uncertainty as to fuel cost, uncertainty as to how other stakeholders are going to respond to it, which will impact their own response. You have tools within FuelEU to enable you to succeed in this mission, things like borrowing, pooling, banking to help you out for the future. You have these particular metrics that can be triggered in the course of using those tools, so you have to be careful. There are some trip hazards. Things like the multiplier for consecutive years of non-compliance, interest on borrowing, but you've also got some bonus factors, so reward factor for wind. You take all of that and you try and map it then onto this complex ecosystem of stakeholders, the shipping industry, and the conduit that you've got really between the regulation, which just impacts kind of one part of the ecosystem, and then everybody else whose behavior you're actually trying to change is commercial contracts, which leaves an awful lot to be worked out in this very high uncertainty environment. And just to make it exciting, the particular backdrop is that if you get it wrong, it'll probably be quite expensive, and there's a continuing contribution to the uncontrolled warming of the planet. So there's a little bit of an apocalyptic flavor there as well, if you were to kind of paint this in I can imagine the graphics for it if Sony were to get their hands on it, I think is where I'm going with that. So that's my elevator pitch on FuelEU. Okay. I don't know if everyone's now flooding out of the lift to go somewhere else.
I think it was, yeah, you covered everything. And I thought it was really interesting early on, you mentioned different time frames. And I think we'll probably mention that a bit later. That's something we sometimes forget, that there's all these kind of overlapping time frames of the stakeholders, their interest time frames. Who'd like to have a go at expanding on that, or simplifying it, or commenting on it? Stavros?
Yeah, maybe I could give it a try. Well, as a naval architect and marine engineer, let's say I will try to. I see it with two different perspectives. The one is the technical side. For me, it's a very clear, let's say, very clear regulation. It defines what is the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuel that you are using on board. It defines, which fuels and how you can categorize these fuels on their the greenhouse gas intensity, looking into of course the EU regulations, RED 2 and RED 3 and etc. And then it defines what is the limit And most of all, and most important of all, I think it defines a specific price of the carbon, basically, which is the penalty. The penalty is very clear. If you meet, let's say, if you don't meet the limit that changes every 5 years, then basically there is a very specific penalty that you can calculate even from the moment that we are now discussing on. It's 2,400 euros per ton of light fuel oil equivalent energy fuel that you're using. But of course, the limit is not 100% of that. It's first you need to reduce by 2%, then you need to reduce by 6%, and etc., etc. So for me, from a technical point of view, it's very clear, and it's nice and open-minding kind of approach, because as ship owners, we have been struggling to find solutions for the decarbonization, and having a clear regulation towards, in the future up to 2050, basically defining a specific penalty. I think it's for me, it's a strong point for this regulation. What it's a little bit complex, and what Rachel just described, is the various shareholders within the shipping industry, how they are connected, depending on the various business models that you have within shipping. Shipping industry is not the same everywhere. It's totally different business model, whatever the company is following, whatever trade you are operating in, the operations profiles, and etc. So there are various shareholders, and there are, I would say, these contractual, commercial issues that are a little bit challenging on actually applying, and who is getting the responsibility of all these issues and the penalties, and how you can actually pass these kind of responsibility to the other shareholders in the complete supply chain. And of course, these mechanisms that also Rachel introduced, like the pooling, banking and borrowing, it for, at least from our point of view, it becomes quite more challenging to address it through this commercial background that you have on shipping.
Thanks, Stavros. And Andreas, you've been very involved with this. Do you have any kind of great overarching way to explain FuelEU Maritime? And I noticed you mentioned 2,400 euros per ton of, what was that again, Stavros, you said, that penalty?
If you see the formula of the penalties, it actually requires you to make this the balance of the greenhouse gas intensity. You are comparing that with the actual limit, which is, let's say, initially there is a limit already existing. Now you need to be 2% lower than that.
Yeah.
And then in order to calculate what is the actual penalty, then you multiply that with 2,400 euros divided by the energy that 1 ton of light fuel oil can give you. So basically, this gives you exactly, that is the 2,400, it's the greenhouse gas intensity that gives you 1 ton of light fuel oil. But of course, it's not that you are paying this penalty 100% for the first year. You're paying 2% of that. For the first 5 years, then you're paying 6% of that for the next 5 years, and then 14.5%, and etc. etc.
Okay, thanks. Just, I'm still trying to get my head around this kind of, again, and we spoke about it earlier this week, this comparison, this kind of connection between physical emissions and money. And this is sorry, Andreas, I cut across you there. You were probably about to give us your kind of simplified FuelEU Maritime, or how would you explain it to someone?
I mean, both Stavros and Rachel has been telling a lot about what it is right now, and so there are limited what I can add to it. But the way that I like to start, and I've been spending a lot of my time in NORDEN trying to educate and make people aware of this regulation coming into force, because many are still preoccupied with EU ETS, especially when I talk to some of our owners or some of our clients. Whenever I mention FuelEU, they're like, no, you mean EU ETS, right? No, there is actually FuelEU coming into force in just a short amount of time. But the way that I like to start explaining what FuelEU is actually take it down and make it say it's a very straightforward legislation. It's about going from A to B, and then in that process, moving from A to B, doing it in a less emitting way. So you have to be greener in going from A to B. Now, where the complexity is coming in is that in going from A to B, you add a lot of stops and jumps that you have to go across. And for instance, the first of them is that, well, technology is not going to help you. Virtually all technology is not going to help you. A new engine is not going to make you more energy efficient. It's going to make you more energy efficient, but it's not going to lower your greenhouse gas intensity in your movement from A to B. There's basically only wind propulsion as a technology tool which can help you in this. And then the greatest complexity, as I see it, is what about the biofuel? Where to get it, how to get it, and how to get it in the right quantity at the right price. And as I'm sure we're going to talk about a bit in the future, I mean, this stage of the process in going from A to B and getting the biofuel to avoid these penalties, the complexity arises when you have a smaller fleet or a larger fleet. If you're a single ship owner, I mean, how are you ever going to make sure that you get to the right port at the right time to get the biofuel in the right quantity that you want to burn for that one specific vessel? So there's a huge element of the scale of operation which helps making this very complex legislation easier, or for the smaller shipping companies, how to make this non-complex regulation very, very complex. So there's a huge imbalance actually arising from going from A to B, depending on what are your strategies, what are your starting point, what is the context from where you come, and I think that's very, very much at the core of what's actually creating this complexity. And as Rachel was also talking about a bit earlier, there's this whole timing issue. And I'm pretty sure that most of the people here in this webinar have already seen or read a bit of the BIMCO clause. And it's clear, I think, to anyone who has been involved in the process of drafting that clause, that is a very good clause for a very, very complex legislation, that because there have been so many added things and going from A to B has gone into a very, very complex legislation, this BIMCO clause is actually going to make a lot of these things a bit easier. But you will never ever find a one size fits all for this. So I think that's how I see it and how I would explain this. It's very at the heart of the legislation. It's very, very straightforward. But because we're adding tires and layers on top of that and workarounds, it becomes increasingly complex. So that I understand why people might still think about EUTS or might not actually just want to forget about FuelEU is coming at all.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, we're having this discussion quite soon before its implementation, for instance. But when you've been doing this now at NORDEN for a while, you're setting yourselves up, and you have your own perspectives. But without going into your strategy, because again, as you're clearly pointing out, it will depend. It will vary a lot, even within one company. What are the factors that go into your machine to decide? There's an output. What are we going to do? So looking at things like alternative fuel options and certification and contracting, what would be your list of things that need to go in, the inputs that need to go into that calculation?
I mean, you're right. It's a huge machine in many ways. There are many parts that are moving at the same time, and even though I would like to say that this is our strategy and it's straightforward and this is how we're going to do it, there are so many additional levels actually coming into play. But in NORDEN, with around 500 vessels operating at any given point in time, we have some of the capabilities that make FuelEU a bit less complex compared to the smaller shipping companies. And on top of that, we've been actually working with biofuels for the past 6 years. And so this biofuel journey that we have been on, already knowing the suppliers, the products, and the dynamics in the biofuel market is an advantage. And to some degree, we see FuelEU as leveling the playing field. And that also means that our strategy is about actually going out there, burning biofuel, generate excess compliance, ensuring that we can get the scale of operations to work in our favor, such that we're not reliant on calling Rotterdam at a given point in time, but we are certain that we have vessels calling any of the larger biofuel hubs. Not that there are that many biofuel hubs currently, but hopefully in the future, this flexibility is going to play even more into our favor, and having the contracts already. So we are working a lot with this pooling arrangement, this pooling mechanism, ensuring that we have some vessels which will generate excess amount of compliance, and we are willing to share that not just across our own fleet, but also across our TC partners' fleet, such that we can actually help generate some compliance for other owners of some of our partners.
Are there any factors that you don't need to include? Is there anything you've identified as that's not actually important for FuelEU Maritime?
I mean, we are looking at every single aspect, and biofuel is going to be our main tool of compliance. I mean, we believe that it's very, very interesting to look at this wind-assisted propulsion, but we also need to make sure that the economies actually add up, and the repayment time is coming down a bit. But we are looking very much into these kind of newest technologies in order to make sure that we are extra compliant. There is one thing that we, to some extent, not have disregarded entirely, but that we have not spent excessive amounts of time on, are these RFMBOs. And I'm sure we will also talk about it a bit later. But in general, with these renewable fuels of non-biological origins, which are, I guess, the best tools available in terms of the greenhouse gas intensity, but we see that so many of the supply-demand issues arising from this, and this is that the supply side is not ready enough to supply sufficient amounts, and the small supply that's actually generated is taken by some other players which have a greater benefit and are willing and risk-seeking enough to actually take this supply. And when I'm saying some other companies, I mean, even if we have 500 vessels, we are a tramp business in Norden. We do not know where our next port is going to be. But there are some companies which can benefit from this and actually have some even better economies than we have in order to be uptakers of the RFMBO. So if I have to put it into like a stepwise, our main tool will be biofuel with the pooling agreements, and then it will be new technologies which are FuelEU compatible, of course. And then at the very bottom, that will be RFMBOs as the market looks right now. But going forward, of course, as the market develops, we will be eager to test it out.
Yeah, I was going to ask what's going to change, do you think, in the future? And of course, the rollout of alternative fuels will be one of the most obvious ones. Maybe there'll be some other differences in strategy with the kind of the requirements ramping up from 2% to 6%, etc. From your perspective, Stavros, what's on your list of factors to include in your thoughts, in your strategic thoughts?
Well, I pretty much agree on what Andreas was describing, but indeed, I mean, that's a very nice strategy that you have set, and I really like it a lot. But, you know, from our point of view, being a smaller company with much smaller fleets operating, and to be honest, over the last years our exposure to Europe it's not so big. I mean, we mainly operate outside Europe. We may have a few voyages, let's say, going to Europe. So it's a little bit challenging to set up a strategy like that, and especially these mechanisms, the mechanism of pooling. We cannot see how we can directly apply it within a fleet of such a small fleet. We have been assessing, and what we have done actually is, as I said, it's from one perspective, FuelEU, it's quite straightforward about the penalties. So you can define, let's say, what will be the expected, let's say, penalties that your ship will pay for a specific operational profile and etc. for specific voyages. And there are already some tools that some classification societies, they are even advertising, and you can use it directly. But we have been doing that ourselves, and of course, having ships of almost 14, 15 years old, the major solution that we have been investigating is, of course, drop-in fuels like the biofuels. But it all comes down to the question, what will be the availability, and of course, what will be the price difference of these fuels compared to the conventional fuels. And this is something that we have been investigating, adding up EU ETS, because this is also, you can it's a straightforward, you can understand what is the CO2 emissions from each fuel. And then, of course, ETS, it's a very volatile market. It depends highly on what will be the price of the EUAs, but we have been doing some sensitivity analysis on EUA prices from one axis, and fuel difference on the other axis, meaning B30 compared to conventional fuel, etc. And we have been looking where the, let's say, penalties, EUAs plus FuelEU penalties, what will be the outcome. So, but still, we would like to go down the the compliance route, but we still see some challenges, especially with respect to how we could apply pooling either in our fleet or, let's say, together with collaboration with other parties. So this is stand. Yeah.
I think we're running kind of two questions into each other, which is fine. But now it's interesting, Rachel. You have this position in between all these factors, but you're getting intimately involved with all these discussions and seeing different clients with different strategic needs and objectives. So you must have an overview of this list of factors which go in. So what would you add anything to that, or what's your perspective?
I would, and it's interesting to hear what Andreas and Stavros say, because I would say that echoes what I hear from a lot of entities insofar as their expectation is that they will go at least a good way of the distance towards compliance by way of using biofuels. That's the kind of primary part of the strategy for most entities that I talk with. I have spoken with a few people who say our cargo is valuable enough and our rates are high enough that we'll pay the penalties for the first year and we'll work it out a bit later. So some people are deferring on compliance strategy. But generally what I hear across different sectors of the market is an appetite to use biofuels, but then to use pooling for the kind of last segment of compliance. And that, I think, that really interests me because the regulations give a little bit of structure to pooling insofar as they create the opportunity to do it, but everything beyond that is a matter of contractual agreement, and it's unclear at the moment, I would say, exactly what that might look like, and there's different possibilities for how it might take form. So there's a couple of issues that arise there. One is, if you plan to pool as part of your compliance strategy, with whom are you planning to pool? Whose compliance surplus do you expect to wed yourself to? Is that someone you've already identified and you're going to put in place a pooling agreement between you? Or are you going to kind of sign yourself up to a larger pool, which perhaps advertises that it has a compliance surplus, but you're not sure exactly which vessels it's coming from? So there's identifying a compliance surplus to begin with, and is there enough in the market to match the appetite to pool with it? There's potentially a supply and demand issue here in terms of compliance surplus. And then there's a question over what is it that you're actually signing up to when you sign up to a pool, and this will completely depend on the contractual architecture of the pool. Is there some kind of guarantee there that a compliance surplus is available? Where does the risk sit if you expect to comply, by way of pooling, but then that compliance surplus doesn't materialize, or doesn't materialize in the quantity you expected. Do you just carry that and you need to have a kind of plan B in place, or is that part of your agreement when you enter the pool that actually the risk sits somewhere else? So there's a lot in relation to pooling which is not sketched out, and I'm aware people are working on putting together pooling arrangements, and their conversations that we're involved in. But I would say, from what I see, it's relatively early days in terms of people actually grappling with these details. So there's a lot of uncertainty in that regard. So to everyone who, and this is, as I say, many entities that I've spoken with who say our compliance strategy is biofuels 1, pooling 2, great. I think there's a high level of awareness around the sort of uncertainty aspects or the difficulties of biofuel, availability, certification, etc. I'd say there's a lower level of awareness in terms of the potential, uncertainties, complications, etc. in connection with pooling. So I think that's an area which the industry as a whole is going to unpackage and start to have a clearer understanding of, and more awareness of the sort of different possibilities once you get into that realm. I think if you take it at face value, it's easy to think, well, pooling's available, so I'll pool. So that's part of my compliance strategy. But it actually requires going quite a bit deeper to really understand how that's going to work for you in any particular individual context. So that's something that we're involved for our clients, looking at, advising on, working on pooling agreements, etc., trying to pull all of that part of this landscape together.
And going back to you mentioned about timeframes and the stakeholders, there's also isn't there an issue with timeframes on pooling as well, because there's compliance periods, and how long does your pool run for, and who's in the pool, who's out of the pool? I could just imagine this getting very complicated when everyone's contracting with each other in various ways. So So I suppose, is it possible that this kind of shakes out into a systemic way of doing it because it's the only way it can actually work?
My expectation is that there'll be quite a few different offerings in the market. Okay. Some entities will just pool in a kind of private context, either just within their own fleet, or perhaps with partners who they partner with just for FuelEU pooling, or perhaps partners who they already share a chartering pool with. So I think there'll be those types of pools. I think there'll also be kind of public pools that you can go to, because this will be particularly relevant perhaps for owners with smaller fleets. They're maybe not going to have the opportunity, the network, the extra headspace to work out a bi or tri or quadrilateral pooling agreement with a few particular partners. They're more likely to want to sign up to some kind of bigger pooling arrangement, I would expect. So I think what we'll actually see in the market is quite a few different options, and it remains to be seen whether over time some of them fall away, some of them are more successful than others.
Okay. And looking again from the point of view of standardization and that, BIMCO you've touched on BIMCO earlier. Could you expand a bit on what's available there for standardized contracting here?
Yeah, sure. So perhaps just to think widely for a moment about the role that we can call them standard form contract terms play in the market, and just to think about why they're valuable. They can be very useful for the market because they define a way of handling something, of responding to a risk or a situation. It's important, I think, to recognize that way isn't going to be appropriate in every scenario. But what it does do is that it gives a starting point that everybody can understand and then deviate from. So I think there's a lot of value in standard form contracts as a starting point. They can fit the space really well as well. But I think they also need to be handled with a little bit of caution, because it's not necessarily the case that you can just take a standard form clause, put it in your whatever contract it's designed for, and job done. Especially with thinking of complex as FuelEU, Now, I've been involved in the BIMCO drafting work for some of the CII clauses and the EU ETS clauses, and I was involved as a member of the sounding board for the FuelEU clause. For anyone who doesn't know how that drafting works, that's done by way of a team. Pretty much everyone in the room is a lawyer. There'll be several lawyers from BIMCO. There will be lawyers from the in-house department of owners and charterers. And there's usually a P&I club representative at the table and the private practice lawyer at the table. So you've got a team of maybe 12 or 15 people who are all giving their input on what they believe the issues are, different ideas for how to address those, and piecing together, usually over months, this is the work of months, not the work of weeks, to bring all of this thought and analysis together into a clause which will fit in the mid-space as much as possible so as to be useful and well balanced, but the clause can't possibly work for every iteration for all kinds of particular scenarios. It can't address every iteration of possibility. A decision that we often have to take when we're looking at drafting in that context is where do we draw the line in terms of what we think we can and we can't address. So that's how it happens, just to kind of give a little peek behind the scenes there. And then what we've got for the FuelEU from BIMCO thus far is the time charter party clause. So if I go back to where we started, which was to say that the shipping industry is a complex ecosystem of stakeholders joined together by commercial contracts, that's often a structure in which you have a registered owner, a bareboat charterer, a ship manager, a time charterer, a voyage charterer, and you've got all kinds of intersecting contracts. Like you might have a contract for refrainment, you've got your fuel supply agreement, you might have a vessel sharing agreement, and then looking more widely than that, events will happen which also require kind of contracts to mobilize them, so things like the sale and purchase of ships. And in all of these spaces, this issue needs to be dealt with. So we tend to start when we are, it's certainly been the case to date, that the response to the decarbonisation regulations for shipping has always started with the time charter party, so working out how things could look in the relationship between owners and charterers. So for FuelEU, we have now the BIMCO clause that sits in the time charter party space. The ship management clause will come forward quite soon. But then there's a lot of space still around that. There are many agreements beyond that kind of core, which is where we often start the time charter party. Many agreements where this needs to be considered and the issues dealt with as between the parties as in their specific situations. So there's a lot of thought that yet needs to be given to how all of this is going to work. So and many different iterations for how it might.
At the beginning of that process, do you, just a kind of a side question there, do you have difficulty recruiting people to join these working groups?
Well, I'm not responsible for that, so
I mean, is there difficulty generally? You don't know.
I've always been happy to be involved, so I can't speak for else. So, but I mean, it's a fascinating experience, and you know, we discuss so many issues around the table, and in some ways, you know, as a private practice lawyer, if I'm drafting just at my desk, you know, it might be myself and a colleague who work on something, so maybe there's only two of us, so we can move with more pace. You know, there's not so many sort of different perspectives to be taken into account, which can be a benefit sometimes. But equally, if you're drafting something for industry, you really need that breadth of perspective. So it's not a quick process. It's usually a very illuminating one, though.
And can I move on?
If I may just, you know, because I have been reading also lately these the BIMCO clause that came out from the time charter, and I have, you know, probably something in line with what we were discussing earlier about timing, because I still struggle a little bit to see how this can actually apply in the market, because BIMCO clause requires, let's say, on the time charter, of course, on a monthly basis, basically to have some sort of an understanding about the FuelEU penalties for the month that has already passed, and someone to pay for these penalties, or etc., or give it back some money, and etc. But I see that quite very difficult to apply in the real world. The reason is that we have already seen for ETS, for example, okay, we and this is the timing that you mentioned, Conor. We have been sailing throughout 2024 under the ETS era, but of course, at the end of the day, nobody has already paid anything as a EUAs, meaning has not surrendered any EUA to the ETS yet, because the circle is that you need to apply, you need to submit your report in 2025, and then you need to submit the EUAs in September 2025. So in a very similar way, FuelEU will have its own circle, let's say. But it is totally different, because ETS is like you have already these CO2 emissions throughout the month. So it's almost certain that you need to pay, you need to have at least EUAs for these emissions. You cannot take them back. For FuelEU is slightly different, because you are monitoring the whole operation throughout the year, and at the end of the year you come up with this greenhouse gas intensity. So throughout the year and on a monthly basis, 1 month you may be good, 1 month you may be paying, but you cannot exchange money here and there, on a monthly basis with the charter. So that is why I feel, because, and I give this comparison with ETS, because although BIMCO clause had also for the ETS, they had that on a monthly basis you need to pay certain amount either in EUAs or in money for these EUAs. Even that was quite straightforward. We have heard of cases of big charters as well that they have said, no, I'm not going to follow that. When is for you to pay the ETS? Is it September 2025? I will give you your EUAs in July 2025, let's say. So I cannot imagine the charters will agree in a similar kind of approach, like, okay, this month I will pay you this amount of money, next month you will pay me back, and then back again and forth. So it is nice as a whole that provides, who is responsible for what, but I think that this kind of arrangement on a monthly basis, it will be very hard for the market to follow. And I don't know, Rachel, if you have any comment on that.
I think you illuminated the issue really well there, Stavros. And it remains to be seen, I think, whether parties uptake this clause and elect for the kind of monthly payment, reimbursement potentially option, or whether they elect for the redelivery or kind of end of the year option. I think from an administrative point of view, the latter is certainly less complex, but from a credit risk point of view, that's perhaps where the parties would lean towards wanting, and this goes both ways really, wanting more of a monthly reconciliation. To me, it's really been one of the key issues when trying to put together a FuelEU clause, because of course we were trying to draft them before, we were drafting them before the BIMCO clause came out. And as soon as you sit down to try to do this work, the first real hurdle that you hit is, well, how do we carve up this yearly average into these little slices of separate charter party? If you're doing it for a charter party that runs for 5 years and starts on the 1st of January and finishes on the 31st of December, that's a different story. And that's really what we took as a starting point in our drafting, to say, well, how is this going to work on a charter party runs for a whole year basis, and then let's try and work outwards from there. And I think the BIMCO clause is a really valiant attempt to deal with that. as you say, I think in practice we'll learn how willing the parties are to do that, whether it becomes actually not as difficult to deal with as it might seem like initially when it's unfamiliar, or whether that falls by the wayside. But this kind of reminds me of the discussions around CII, where you're doing something similar. You're taking a kind of yearly average metric and trying to ascribe some kind of liability for it to these segments of time that don't cover a full reporting year. So I feel like the industry kind of going around the loop a little bit on this particular issue of how do you take that and reduce it down, into your sort of next layer of stakeholders.
Yeah, I can see Andreas has some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, it's true. It's very difficult to find a time charter party which starts on the 1st of January and ends on the 31st of December. I mean, those don't exist except in a BIMCO clause apparently. And I think that, as you say, Rachel, this choice of per voyage or monthly really comes down to the choice of what is my credit risk versus what is my administrative burden. And again, for some companies, it will make much more sense to work with one side of the equation or the other. And I think there's a good reason why that the BIMCO clause actually defaults on the upon redelivery or upon the payment period, because that is what makes the least administrative burden on the companies, and what we most likely also observe in the market. At least that's our opinion. I mean, again, coming from a company with quite a good credit rating, don't think that our owners will be wanting to have this administrative burden of sending back and forth. And then there's also the entire issue of the verification of data. I mean, we will not want to send a lot of money based on estimated figures or some system that has calculated something and might be wrong and might not be wrong. I mean, once we actually have the verified data, then it's something different. And that's, again, also a bit related to the EU ETS, because there is also the issue of verification. And I think that this issue of verification is just extrapolated even more onto FuelEU, especially also when we take that onto the verification of the bunker delivery notices and all of the fuel that we're going to burn, because verification is also really like the data, MRV data and everything that we actually are measuring here is so extremely important. And getting this verification is also, of course, a cost for the companies that have to buy these services, verification services. And what the industry is willing to pay for this is also depending on how often and how frequent it will be. But I think that we are definitely going to see an industry converging towards using these upon redelivery payments. And then, of course, as Rachel, you mentioned very correctly, there is a huge element of credit risk, especially if you're dealing with some more sketchy counterparties, which I know are somewhere to be found in the shipping industry.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'd like to just switch things over a little bit and just go back to our lift or elevator in the hotel. But now we've reached the conference, and we're having coffee at a break in a conference, and you get talking to someone, and they tell you that they are considering ordering a dual-fueled, the dual fuel being ammonia, a very large ammonia tanker, because they think there's going to be a big potential for trading ammonia in the future, a bigger potential. But when they look at the potential between, say, the US Gulf and Europe for the blue ammonia trade, they're a bit concerned about the impact on their ambitions from FuelEU Maritime and even Fit for 55. So what would you say to them about the pros and cons or impact of FuelEU on their ambition to run this dual fuel ammonia tanker between the US Gulf and Europe? Who wants to start that one?
I mean, I can start with a bit of insight lead from Norden. I mean, in Norden, we're not working with these ammonia RFMBOs or these blue fuel types yet. Of course, is something that's in the horizon. But there are always a value in the flexibility, especially on a dual fuel engine, because you can then switch between what's the pricing, and it's not giving that. Because there's also another side to the equation, is that once the biofuel demand will increase, there will also potentially be a auto diverging trend for the fossil fuels. So that actually means that on some levels, the fossil fuels can, for the bunkers at least, to put on vessels, could become cheaper, especially with regards to also the inventories build up as they need to be replenished. So there is actually a higher value of the flexibility of dual fuel engines coming into play, especially as FuelEU becomes stronger and stronger. And I mean, I would be very happy if I had that flexibility to work within my compliance strategy to change between these. So it has a value, but of course, RFNBOs in the current state, there is this huge supply demand circus, I want to call it, because where can you get it? What is going to be the price? And are you actually on a large tanker vessel? Are you actually going to be able to be the one who can pay the most for it? Because the production facilities are not going to be in these specific train ports. They're going to be in the big liner and ferries ports, and that's going to be the main issue why it's might not be the best option. And also, if we're looking at the new building order book, we see globally that the dual fuel engines are taking up a larger and larger portion, but we also see that larger and larger portion is not found in the tramp business. It is found in the container liners, which have increased their amount of new buildings in this segment.
If I can add a few more points on the question, Conor, and if I got it correct, your question was basically comparing basically RFNBO, meaning green ammonia, let's call it green, and the blue ammonia that would be produced in US and then transported to Europe. We have been involved on that.
It's like, you know, the thinking you get in the shipbuild, it can run on ammonia. It may well be carrying blue ammonia from the US. Could that be a fuel in the dual fuel scenario? What would be the impacts going into Europe?
Yeah, well, look, in general, because we have been in the ammonia trade in the past, and we still are, and we are looking very interestingly on the new. Oops, I think we lost Andreas. But we have been very much looking into this new market that, let's say, it's emerging with ammonia transportation as an energy hydrogen vector, let's say, either blue or green. We see a lot of projects, at least on preliminary stage and etc. I would say that FuelEU, it will not be the major issue here. The main issue will be the trade itself, meaning that the blue ammonia producers in US, they will have to make sure that this blue ammonia will be let's say, ammonia that it is recognized in EU as a low carbon ammonia. And honestly, Europe had been quite, I would say, reluctant to go to the blue pathway in the past. Nowadays, we see some sort of a change of direction, and they are more open to look into these blue kind of alternatives. So I would say it will be mainly an issue of the complete trade to be set up and say, okay, I have a product that it is acceptable in Europe. So if it is acceptable, it will also be acceptable for FuelEU. So yes, we have seen an interest from these producers around the world that they would be very much interested to burn ammonia instead of, let's say, conventional fuels for the ships. But I would say, just give an extra tip here, is that go down to the actual calculations about, because ammonia, you will need much more quantities of ammonia for the same amount of energy required on the ship. So at the end of the day, it will be a matter of consumption of ammonia and what is the price of that product, of that fuel, compared to, let's say, biofuels or any kind of other alternatives that you may have on the fuel. So, but at the end of the day, it's I don't think that it will be a matter of FuelEU obstacle or struggle point. It will be mainly an issue about RED 3 requirements and what are the standards that each country, the producer country, uses, either China or US, and etc.
Yeah, I see there was mention there of that terrible passage I read earlier with the recast gas directive for low carbon fuels, or yeah, for but isn't there a reward for RFNBOs? I mean, it could be we could be talking about another case where it's methanol. It was just an example I gave, but there's a reward for RFNBOs under FuelEU, isn't there?
Yes, there is in the calculation that it is it doubles actually the benefits that you can get for the first years at least.
Yeah, until 2033 or something like that.
33, yeah. And then they will reevaluate what is the let's say the adoption of these RFNBOs in the industry coming into in the shipping that is coming into Europe, and then they will evaluate whether they can extend these benefits actually in the future, I think.
So we have these technical realities in interpretation of the regulations. We have the contracting side of that, and then we have the commercial side of this. And we have kind of an overall, what I would call a meta issue of communication and education within the various functions in a given business and externally, because the life cycle assessment of the fuel, of course, is pivotal to all this. It has to actually have an impact. It is the market-based instruments are supposed to assist with climate change, so we can't lose sight of that. But it has to translate in the CO2 equivalent per megajoule has to translate down the line into some sort of commercial agreement. And maybe actually, Rachel, you have some thoughts on how is that conversation managing to be? You're a working group with for contractual arrangements. Are you seeing a lot of confusion in companies between the functional areas?
I'm seeing a need to bring all of those together. And actually, I was on a call yesterday with Contracting and Classification Society, and we were talking about these issues. And it's not really the case that you can solve, that you can put together your FuelEU response, that you can kind of resolve these particular issues as they come up just from, say, a legal perspective or just from a technical perspective. What we see is that you really need to bring together the people who've got those perspectives, contractual, technical, commercial, and get them all talking together. Something that I've noticed and been involved in with clients is that there's kind of an internal task force approach here quite often, because you need your people from different divisions of the business to be having a joined up conversation. And then when you go to your external experts, like ourselves as lawyers, or like your classification society as a technical expert, or perhaps another technical advisor, it's helpful if they can be part of the same conversation and not just giving their input sort of into, in a vacuum, without that kind of cross-fertilization. Something that we've done for clients before is we've joined forces with technical advisors so that we advise jointly on an issue, so that you're getting that input from both sides and we're coordinated in what we're doing. You're not just receiving, well, here's some legal input, here's some technical input, and now we need to try and weave this together and work out where the gaps are, or what still needs to be resolved, or how we might resolve those. If you bring your people together so we can all work on it together, that's a good way to go forward, I would suggest. I don't know if maybe Andreas has a comment to add to that from a NORDEN perspective, where you've got lots of different divisions of the business and departments. I know from my own time working in-house in a big shipping organization, part of the job is navigating that internal landscape and making sure that everyone who can valuably contribute is actually at the table.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my job has been trying to connect this technical side to the commercial side, and actually take this very technical, at the heart, very technical legislation and make it commercialable take these CO2 equivalents per megajoule and try to convert it into something that's either $1 per ton or $1 per day. Spending a lot of time that, and it's funny because when I show the legislation to our engineers in the sustainability department, they say, well, this is easy peasy math. It's so simple, this, guys. I mean, come on. And then when you go down to the commercial departments, they're like, stop. So there's an extreme work of translation going on, and has to go on in real time. Like at any given time when you have to assess a voyage or a fueling stop, we have to assess what are the actual commercial implications of this very technical specification. And in the end, it's about, and I think also again that BIMCO has actually done a decent amount of work on this one. It's about saying like what is actually important, how can we translate this, how can we use it to make commercial decisions? Because at the end of the day, FuelEU is a tax on the on the bunkers that we consume in EU waters, and we have to price that element into it. And then it's actually how are we going to price it? Well, we're going to price it we can price it in different ways, of course, depending on what we divide the dollar amount with. But at the end of the day, like FuelEU is approximately, I think, $60 per ton of fossil fuel, depending on what type, of course, you're using as a penalty. And that's a good starting point to actually make it into a commercial decision, that you have an upper layer, that this is how, in a theoretical commercial way at least, that you can price this at its highest point. And then when you have to do the pricing, on the other hand, you have to again take this very more technical biofuel substitution. What if we actually put in some biofuel but remove some fossil fuel? And then we're also saving a bit on our EUAs, but probably have to pay a bit up for the deviation cost to get to a specific biofuel port, and the barges available for biofuel are also limited and more expensive. So I mean, there's all of this that we actually have to translate in real time into a technical, from a technical point of view into a commercial point of view. And to put it fair, that has been a huge part of my job for the last at least 4 or 5 months, when we actually started like dealing with FuelEU on a commercial side, is to make sure that we have commercial people whose main responsibility is to go out, make great deal with clients, have a sustained relationship with our owners and so forth. And when they have to perform this, it doesn't help that they are talking about well-to-wake intensity and life cycle assessments. That's not what their relationship, what their job task is about. Their job task is about saying the dollar per day, and how can we actually use this regulation to making our relationships better today than they were yesterday. And in order to do that, we need to have some data, we need to have some systems, but we need to make sure that these systems help us convert things into something which is commercial, manageable.
Yeah, definitely. It's the kind of question that people like to ask me over a cup of tea at the conference. They'll say, how would you price a FuelEU compliance surplus?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
This is not an over a cup of coffee.
Andreas over here.
Let me just pull in the team of technical, commercial, other experts.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell us the situation.
Yeah. And we haven't talked a bit about certification and what's going to be on the bunker delivery note, and when is all that going to be available? You know, is it going to be weeks and weeks after you've taken a stem of various bunkers? But I think that maybe what we can do is go into the audience questions now, because this will come up probably. And I know a few of the names here. Please, the rest of you listening, keep putting your questions in. We'll start now. And I see that there's a voting mechanism in the Q&A, so you can actually poll each other's questions, it looks like, to push them up to the top of the list. So sorry, Paul Woodall. Hi, Paul. Haven't seen you for a while. Sorry, but I will get to your question as well. So at the top, we have Konstantinos Simotas. If you only use fossil fuels, does the bunker delivery note need to include a LCV, I think it's a life cycle value, or not? And for the carbon factors, can you use the default ones set out in EU directive? Does anybody want to try and answer that?
Yes, actually, if you look into the FuelEU regulation for fossil fuels, it's pretty straightforward. Actually, it's already predefined values for the well to wake and for the tank to wake, and tank to wake carbon factor. So it's The tables are in there, so you can make your own calculations to see how much. And that is also the reason why you can very easily translate on, if you continue burning fossil fuel, what will be your penalty for the first 5 years, the next 5 years, and etc. etc.
I hope that answers your question, Konstantinos. Any other comments on that, or should we move on to the next one? Catherine Forrest. Rachel, you mentioned IMO in your intro. Do you foresee alignment with FuelEU and the IMO amendment direction coming in spring 2025?
Great question, because we've not really touched on the interaction yet between the EU legislation and the IMO legislation, which would be a global application. I suppose the dream for the industry is that the IMO comes forward with something that is sufficiently impactful that it will apply globally, and we won't end up with a patchwork of slightly different regulation, which is all aiming in the same direction, but the details are different. FuelEU has in it provisions for review of the legislation in light of whatever legislation the IMO brings forward. And I was sitting on a panel in Amsterdam actually a while ago with someone from the EU Commission and the chair of the MEPC, so the part of the IMO that deals with this. And it was very clear in the course of our discussions there that if the IMO brings forward sufficiently impactful legislation, the intention is that the EU legislation can be withdrawn. Whether we'd actually get to that point, whether the IMO whether the EU would deem that the IMO legislation is sufficiently does the job it needs to do, remains to be seen. But we could be looking at a future where FuelEU doesn't actually exist within a few years' time. Looking at the timeframes in the legislation for the review, etc., for the bringing forward of the IMO legislation, before 2030, we could be in a position where FuelEU doesn't in fact exist anymore. So I think it's a great question, Catherine. We'll have to wait to see, I think, what emerges from the IMO in April 2025, and then wait a bit longer to see what the EU's perspective is on that.
So hopefully all the work being done for FuelEU will feed directly into the IMO. And
yeah, I suppose the dream maybe is that it's sufficiently similar that everyone can kind of rebrand what they did for FuelEU and keep doing it. But we'll see.
So maybe a side question. Well, no, maybe that's too speculative. So we'll go on to the next question. Stephanos Spaneas, is the use of biofuels and banking of the surplus until of biofuels and banking of the surplus until 2030, where the surplus can be sold for a better price, a straightforward tactic? Okay.
I can take that one.
Can you read it there, Andreas? Yeah.
From my opinion, it's not a straightforward tactic. It's a good tactic. It will be a profitable tactic, but it's not a straightforward tactic. And the reason I'm saying that is that, first of all, there's the whole price mechanism. The reason why it's a good tactic is because, as I mentioned earlier, the cap of pricing will always be the penalty. But then there is the other issue also, that the lower pricing will then be the biofuel, and we have no idea about the biofuel movement in price. I mean, that also depends on, again, on supply and demand. It might be that the supply side of the equation actually experiences a shock, and we will therefore be producing much more in 5 years than we do today, or something else can happen. And then there's also the issue, at least from our point, my point of view, is the capital investment that you have to make today in order to create a sufficient surplus for you to make that transaction in 2030. You have to make sure that you can get a lot of biofuel today or in the next couple of years. You have to make sure that you get them at the right price, and then, in the right place, that you can actually burn them and generate these excessive amounts of compliance. And that means you have to stay within EU waters or to and from EU waters. And then there is, as I just mentioned, there is this price element that you have to actually multiply the tons consumed by the price you pay, and then you have to bank that amount. So it means that you have a time value of money, you have some money that you have to fix into your compliance balance that you cannot spend on other things that might actually prove a better return. And I think, therefore, when you look at it in this broader picture, I mean, a very isolated, yes, it's a good strategy, and but it's not straightforward. But once you actually take it all into your capital environment, then it's not actually given that it's a good tactic either, because there could be other returns that would be better for your capital investment.
Okay. Any expansions on that?
No, I agree. Actually, it goes down to this pricing. What is the pricing mechanism that you can use when you have this surplus? But generally, one thing is how much surplus I can create, meaning burning biofuels or RFNBO. The more that I burn, the more surplus that I create. But then when you start translating this surplus into actual money, then it comes down to what is the price, how much did I pay extra, what was the premium price that I paid for these fuels in order to get this surplus. So this is what will give you the actual pricing mechanism. So I agree with Andreas. So I don't see why we believe that in 5 years or 10 years time from now, these fuels will be at higher price than they are now. So most probably now I will be paying more in order to generate this surplus, because these fuels are quite expensive. But everybody foresees or hopes, let's say, that in the future these prices will come down. At least we hope so.
Rachel, I see you nodding your head. Have you anything more to add?
No, I think only just to perhaps to summarize it as I see it, which is that the price for a compliance surplus has got to sit between the cost of biofuels or our MBOs and the price that you would pay in penalties, and that's your bracket. Yeah. Where exactly it falls in that bracket is, needs a bit more technical input, as just discussed. But to me, that's the territory.
So I think the next question from Rav Matlag, hi Rav, is given the high penalty, there is a strong incentive to avoid the penalty by purchasing surplus compliance via a pool. How do you think the market price for surplus compliance will be determined?
I think we've answered
that. Is that covered, Ralph? Let's write another question if you want to put it another way, or if you think it's not covered.
I mean, I'll just add a comment to that, because here in our question, in the answer before, where we said that there's a limit at the penalty pricing and there's a floor at the biofuel substitution element. I mean, that's also very isolated looking at the tram business. What we need to remember is also that there is some industry spillover effect that if we see actually the large container liners, they will generate excessive amounts of surplus, may potentially at a cheaper price because they have way more predictability, and they will maybe even get some of these RFNBOs which are available. We actually potentially will see that these liners will be able to provide cheaper means of pooling compared to a tram business. I mean, at least in theory. So we have to remember that there's also this spillover, which makes it even more difficult to price this pooling arrangement, because there are also other actors which might actually be able to generate lower cost of compliance than, for instance, a tram group such as NORDEN.
Or like LNG carriers, I would add, because the LNG carriers, let's not forget that LNG for the first 5 years at least, it may be compliant. So at least for some LNG carriers. So, and they are burning their cargo basically. So it's for them, it's much lower the price. It's not an actual fuel. So there are I would say some segments that we expect that they can generate this surplus at quite big quantities. But the question is what they are going to do. Are they going to bank it for the next years? Are they going to offer it as a pool? Are they going to use it inside the groups for their own pools? Or are they going to offer it to the market? And at what price, of course?
Mm-hmm. And the next question, and I'm going to do your name no service, Keshi van den Berg. Are there any concerns regarding the availability and or pricing of biofuels in the near future? What are the alternatives then? I think we've touched on that a fair bit, but Do we have any of you have anything to add about biofuels and alternatives?
I'll just add to that, which is that bunkers has always been fertile territory for dispute in terms of the physical qualities of the fuel. I don't think that will change when we move into biofuels. We're dealing with quite new products in lots of cases. So things like issues arising in respect of contamination or kind of unexpected physical behaviours of the fuel, that's a major factor with bunkers. We've added to them essentially this additional element of what are the sustainability characteristics of the fuel. And my prediction is that that's an area which will also be fertile territory for disputes. Bunker fraud is something that happens. And when you're dealing with an intangible quality, that's perhaps there's potentially a bit more scope there for fuels to be misrepresented, sold as they're not, difficulties with documentation, etc. So I think availability is one question, but then another is what are you actually getting in terms both of the physical characteristics of the fuel, but also the sustainability characteristics of the fuel.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's these factors. Yeah, it used to be, the fuel quality according to ISO standards, and now we have a whole life cycle to take into account, and verifying that and qualifying credentials, and perhaps trading credentials over book and trade, etc. And there's an awful lot still to be worked out there. I think it's a rabbit hole we should probably stay away from a little bit today, but suffice to say, certification and verification of future fuels and existing fuels is going to expand out into a huge topic as well. Michael Heistrup says, I think this is a statement more than a question. The penalty of 2,400 euros is not only 2%, 6%, 13% as the reduction targets. The penalty for non-compliance is set at 2,400 euros per metric ton of very low sulfur fuel oil equivalent exceeding the prescribed greenhouse gas intensity limits. Is that a fair clarification? It is. This is a point that I think it's a fair clarification now. Yeah. Snehansu Mahapatra, do you think scrubbers will secure the market share to balance CII regulations in EU region and perhaps the global fleet?
I don't get it, but generally scrubbers have nothing to do with CO2 emissions. It's SOx emissions. I don't know if by scrubbers we are talking about onboard carbon capture, because
maybe
it's like a development of the technology, but still we could say that onboard carbon capture is not currently covered by FuelEU, but at least we know that Europe is looking on that and how they could let's say develop the regulation so that to cover also the option of onboard carbon capture, but still not something concrete on that.
See, there's a reward factor for wind at the end of the formula. Wind may be a more interesting place to look for me anyway.
Wind, definitely. I mean, okay, it's the common, let's say, joke around what we have been discussing with many people in shipping, that as the formula is right now, you can simply install a wind-assisted propulsion without even using it, and just getting benefits out of that in FuelEU. It's pretty straightforward.
Which is, I find it interesting that wind is considered an efficiency measure in a lot of the thinking, where it's actually it's a fuel. It's not something that helps you be more efficient. It actually pushes you along. So, but that's so far how far wind has managed to get into the conversation with fuels. I suppose they're not very compatible in some ways. Atsonios Leferis, will it become a necessity for vessels that do not use fuels with sea slip as potential fuel to monitor consumption per emission source? I'm not sure I understand that question.
Yeah, that sounds quite technical, but I'm happy to pick up the one below, which is how can the credit risk be eliminated? Some early thoughts on that are that perhaps the parties might want to consider an escrow arrangement, so whereby that the money that would move between them is paid into kind of third-party accounts that can only be accessed under certain situations as agreed in the escrow arrangement. So that's something that you'd want to set up by your lawyer normally for an escrow scenario. That's one thought.
Yeah. So this is kind of escrow arrangements and putting money aside for eventualities.
Yeah.
Yeah. Predicted eventualities.
Yeah. so that it's not in either party's. You're neither in a position whereby charterers have paid a significant surcharge to owners, but would then be entitled to be reimbursed that, but for the fact that owners become insolvent, say.
Okay. Yeah.
Or owners are waiting to receive from charterers a significant surcharge,
Yeah.
but charterers become insolvent. So what you might do is, rather than kind of passing that money backwards and forwards all the time, is either have it paid into a kind of third party account, or put some money there that you then divide back between the parties later once you've dealt with the reporting year and you know what the position is, and so you're protected from your counterparty insolvency risk.
Kind of reconcile it.
Yeah.
The C-slip question, I think that could be about fuels which have a problem with slip, like maybe LNG. But I haven't heard anything that the slip factors are not so far integrated. I don't think anywhere.
They are methane slip and NO2. They are also N2O. Actually, they are encountered. But the question is not very clear to me. What to monitor the consumption per emission source. Yeah, it's not very clear, but yes, actually, the FuelEU it has difference on depending on what type of consumer you're using. If it is let's say high pressure 2-stroke engine, or if it is a 4-stroke low pressure engine that has a higher methane slip. So this is already
okay. Then I think the question is it likely that you're going to have to actually monitor emissions to prove your slip?
Honestly, I don't remember if there is any option on that, but I think there have been some discussions on that. To be honest, I don't think that there is any option in the regulation right now.
Maybe we've covered that question. Maybe not. In the interests of time, I think that we're getting close to the half hour, and we're supposed to stop after an hour and a half. Although this has been a really interesting conversation, I can sit here for another few hours. Sorry, everybody listening, maybe you can reach out to us individually if you have further questions. I think these people here are very knowledgeable indeed. Can we just round up with the final question to all of you? So, hardly 5 years from now, and we know how quickly 5 years can go past. It's halfway through 2031. What are the remaining growing pains with FuelEU Maritime? I guess what I'm asking is, what is the status of FuelEU Maritime? How comfortable are we? Let's imagine, put the IMO aside for a second. Let's imagine it's turned into IMO. So it's the same question, but IMO. What's the status? Is everything perfect? Everything running smoothly, like clockwork?
My feeling is it's a new era, because you're into, at this point, the more stringent targets, which means that your compliance strategy needs to be updated. And if you're a passenger or a container ship, you're now also subject to the shore power requirements as well. So there's a new factor there. So work still in progress is my summary.
If I may just cover one more question, because I see he was talking about spot market. It is from David Shale. As vessel owners trading in the spot market, would you be bunkering with B30 early in 2025 or waiting to see your exposure? I would say the latter, as the second option, meaning that we would see how the exposure progresses, and then we would make a decision to go for B30, not starting very early on that. Now, about your question, Conor, I think also that from a technical, as I said, from a technical perspective, I think it's pretty much straightforward. There are still some things that need to be clarified, but still the industry will need some time in order to get along with various contractual issues and all these communication with various shareholders, as Rachel has very well described at the beginning, that how we do what and who is responsible for what and how we can verify, monitor, and etc., all the processes, so that everybody is happy and we have a process that it is well defined. But it will take some time to get there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can just add in the very end, like I think that we can see these 5 years as a trial period. When we go into 2030 and beyond, that's when the real magic starts to happen. And that's when the real work with FuelEU is actually going to play. So we have 5 years of learning, and then it's getting serious.
Okay, so lots of work to do, whether in the FuelEU Maritime or the IMO takes it up, and we can all be moved into a new realm. I think we're on the hour, past the hour. Thank you very much, Rachel, Stavros, Andreas. It's been really, really interesting. I've certainly learned a lot. I'm sorry if there's any questions we didn't get to. I think you can probably reach out to us afterwards, those of you in the with questions still. And thank you very much. Have a great Christmas or whatever holiday you celebrate over this time. And I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.